My own family brushed off my wedding, called it insignificant. But my billionaire in-laws turned it into the event of the century, and now everyone regrets not coming. I stood radiant. Can you imagine walking down the aisle, about to marry the man you love, and realizing you have absolutely no idea who your husband really is? My own parents called my fiancé a nobody and flat out refused to show up, but they had no idea they were about to miss the wedding that would make headlines across 3 states, expose a shocking secret about my husband, and completely shatter everything I thought I knew about my family and myself. The engagement ring felt impossibly heavy on my finger as I twisted it, staring at my phone screen. 3 missed calls from Mom, 2 from Dad, and a string of texts that made my stomach knot into a tight, sickening ball. Eleliana, we've thought about this extensively, and we simply cannot support this union. Your father and I have invested too much in your future to watch you throw it away on a carpenter from Montana. Until you come to your senses, we won't be attending this so-called wedding. I dropped the phone onto the kitchen counter of our tiny Denver apartment, my eyes scanning the scattered wedding planning chaos. Mason, my incredible fiancé, was pulling double shifts at the construction site downtown, doing whatever he could to help pay for our modest ceremony. I was picking up extra teaching assignments at 3 different schools. We'd scraped and saved every single penny for months just to afford the small church rental and a reception at the community center. The irony wasn't lost on me. My parents, Dr. Patricia Jones and attorney Richard Jones, had always preached about character over wealth. Yet here they were, refusing to even meet the man I loved just because he didn't have a college degree or, apparently, a trust fund. Mason walked through the door just as I was wiping tears from my cheeks. His work boots clunked on our creaky hardwood floors, even covered in sawdust and concrete powder. He was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. His dark hair was sticking up in all directions, but those green eyes immediately found mine, filled with concern. What's wrong, Ella? I handed him my phone without a word. He read the messages in silence, his jaw tightening with each line. When he finished, he gently set the phone down and pulled me into his arms. I'm so sorry, he whispered into my hair. I know how much you wanted them there. It's not your fault, I choked out, my voice cracking. They're snobs. But I never imagined getting married without my parents there. Mom was supposed to help me with my dress. Dad was supposed to walk me down the aisle. Mason pulled back to look at me, his calloused hands framing my face. We don't need their approval, Elle. We never did. And honestly, my family's going to love you so much, you'll forget all about them. I managed a weak smile. The truth was, I hadn't met much of Mason's family yet. His parents lived in a pretty remote area of Montana where cell service was spotty, and they'd been traveling extensively. All I really knew was that his father, Robert Carter, had some kind of business that kept them busy, and his mother, Susan, was apparently super excited to finally meet me. They'd confirmed they'd fly in for the wedding, along with Mason's younger sister, Emma, and a few cousins. Tell me again about your family, I said, settling into his arms on our thrift store couch. I'm nervous about meeting them all at once. Mason chuckled, that low rumble I'd fallen in love with. There's nothing to be nervous about. Dad's quiet, but incredibly kind. He'll probably try to fix something in our apartment within 5 minutes of meeting you. Mom will want to cook for you and ask a million questions about your students. Emma's going to steal you away from me to talk about books. She's getting her PhD in literature. He pressed a kiss to the top of my head. They trust my judgment. Plus, I've told them enough about you that they feel like they already know you. Mom actually said she's never heard me talk about anyone the way I talk about you. The wedding was still 3 weeks away, but the stress of planning everything ourselves was taking its toll. We'd booked the sweetest little church on the outskirts of Denver, with white wooden pews and stained glass windows that caught the afternoon light perfectly. The reception would be at the community center next door, where we planned to serve barbecue from Mason's favorite local restaurant and a simple 3-tier cake from the grocery store bakery. It wasn't glamorous, but it was us. Mason had even built our wedding arch himself, crafting it from reclaimed wood he'd found at the construction site. I'd made the centerpieces from wildflowers we'd picked together in the mountains. Everything was simple, heartfelt, and exactly what we wanted. Except now, the guest list had shrunk considerably. My parents' absence meant my entire side of the church would be nearly empty. I had a few college friends flying in and my elderly Aunt Margaret, but that was it. The thought of walking down that aisle to mostly empty pews made my chest tight. Maybe we should postpone, I said quietly. Save up more money. Try to work things out with my parents. Elle. Mason's voice was firm. Look at me. I met his eyes. We're not postponing our lives for people who can't see how incredible you are. Our wedding is going to be perfect because we'll be there, promising to love each other forever. That's all that matters. He was right. But it didn't make the hurt any less sharp. I dreamed of my wedding day since I was little, and in every version, my parents were there, beaming with pride. Instead, they were probably at their country club, right at that moment, telling their friends about their daughter's unfortunate life choices. Over the next few days, I threw myself into wedding preparations with renewed determination. If my parents wanted to miss out on the happiest day of my life, that was their loss. I altered my grandmother's vintage lace dress to fit perfectly, practiced my vows until I could recite them without crying, and confirmed all the details with our vendors. Mason's family arrived 2 days before the wedding, and I was honestly shocked by how normal they seemed. I don't know what I'd expected, but Robert Carter looked like an older version of Mason, tall, broad-shouldered, with kind eyes and hands that had clearly seen hard work. Susan was petite and energetic, with graying brown hair and the same infectious smile as her son. She hugged me like she'd known me for years. Finally, she exclaimed, "Mason has told us so much about you. I feel like we're old friends already." Emma, Mason's sister, was exactly as advertised, a book lover with wild, curly hair and an easy laugh. She immediately started asking me about my favorite novels and whether I'd read her current dissertation topic on contemporary American literature. They'd rented rooms at a modest hotel downtown and insisted on taking us out for dinner at a casual Italian place. Nothing about their behavior suggested anything other than a middle-class family from rural Montana. Robert talked about the weather and asked about my teaching. Susan wanted to know if I needed help with any last-minute wedding preparations. Emma told stories about Mason's childhood that made me laugh until my sides ached. The only thing that struck me as slightly unusual was how they'd arrived. I'd assumed they'd driven from Montana, but Mason mentioned they'd flown in. When I asked about it later, he just shrugged and said his dad had found a good deal on flights. The night before the wedding, I lay awake staring at the ceiling of our bedroom. Tomorrow, I'd become Mrs. Aleliana Carter. In less than 18 hours, I'd be walking down the aisle of that little white church, hopefully without tripping over my grandmother's dress, to marry the man who'd changed my entire world. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Congratulations on your wedding tomorrow. We're so looking forward to celebrating with you. The Carter family." I smiled in the darkness. At least one family would be there to witness our vows. At least someone would be cheering when Mason and I promised to love each other forever. I had no idea that by this time tomorrow night, I'd be questioning everything I thought I knew about the quiet carpenter I was about to marry. The morning of my wedding arrived with Colorado's signature brilliant blue sky and crisp mountain air. I woke up in my childhood friend Sarah's guest room where I'd spent the night, following the old tradition of not seeing the groom before the ceremony. Sarah had driven down from Boulder to be my maid of honor, and she was already bustling around with coffee and breakfast pastries. "Today's the day, Mrs. Carter," she sang, throwing open the curtains. "How are you feeling?" "Terrified and excited and nauseous," I admitted, pulling the covers over my head. "Is that normal?" "Completely normal. Now get up because we have exactly 4 hours to transform you into a bride and your hair appointment is in an hour." The beauty salon Sarah had found was a small local place that specialized in vintage-inspired styles. As the stylist worked my long brown hair into soft waves reminiscent of the 1950s, I found myself actually relaxing for the first time in weeks. This was really happening. In a few hours, I'd be married to Mason. My phone rang just as the stylist was adding the final bobby pins to secure my grandmother's pearl hair comb. The caller ID showed Aunt Margaret's name, and my heart immediately jumped to my throat. "Margaret, is everything okay?" "Oh, honey," her voice was shaky. "I'm so sorry. I'm at Denver General. I fell this morning and broke my hip. They're taking me to surgery in an hour." The blood drained from my face. Aunt Margaret was the only family member I had left who was actually going to show up for my wedding. She was supposed to walk me down the aisle since my father had made it clear he wouldn't be there. "Don't worry about the wedding," she continued quickly. "You go ahead and have your beautiful day. I'll be thinking of you every minute." "Margaret, I should come to the hospital." "Absolutely not. You have a wedding to attend, young lady. Your own wedding. Promise me you won't leave that church." After I hung up, Sarah immediately wrapped me in a hug, careful not to mess up my hair. "I'm so sorry, Elle, but she's right. You can visit her tomorrow on your honeymoon layover." I nodded, blinking back tears. Now I really will be walking down the aisle alone. No family at all. You have me, Sarah said firmly. And you have Mason's family. Sometimes the family we choose is more important than the family we're born into. An hour later, we arrived at the little white church. It looked even more beautiful than I remembered, with Mason's handcrafted wooden arch positioned perfectly at the altar, decorated with the wildflower arrangements we'd made together. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, casting rainbow patterns across the wooden pews. But something was different. There were cars in the parking lot. A lot of cars. Expensive cars. A sleek black Mercedes sedan sat next to a pristine white BMW SUV. Behind them was a silver Porsche and what looked like a Tesla. My stomach dropped as I wondered if my parents had changed their minds and decided to show up after all, bringing their wealthy friends as some kind of power move. Those aren't your parents' cars, are they? Sarah asked, voicing my exact thought. I don't think so. Dad drives a Lexus and Mom has that ridiculous white Cadillac. We walked through the church's side entrance and I immediately heard voices coming from the main sanctuary. A lot of voices. The church sounded full. Sarah peeked around the corner and her eyes went wide. Ella, you need to see this. I joined her at the doorway and nearly gasped. The church was packed. Every single pew was filled with people I'd never seen before, all dressed impeccably. The women wore elegant dresses and sophisticated jewelry, while the men were in expensive-looking suits. They were chatting quietly among themselves, but there was an energy in the air that felt completely different from what I'd expected for our simple ceremony. Who are all these people? I whispered. Before Sarah could answer, Susan Carter appeared at my elbow. She looked radiant in a navy blue dress that probably cost more than my monthly salary, though she wore it with the same warm smile she'd had at dinner. Eleliana, you look absolutely stunning, she said, embracing me carefully. That dress is exquisite. Susan, I don't understand. Who are all these people? We only invited about 30 guests in total. Susan's smile became slightly mysterious. Well, dear, when word got out about Mason's wedding, a few more people expressed interest in attending. Family, friends, business associates of Robert's. I hope you don't mind that we expanded the guest list a bit. A bit? I looked back at the packed sanctuary. There have to be over 200 people in there. Actually, it's closer to 300, Susan said cheerfully. But don't worry about that now. You have more important things to think about. Are you ready? My head was spinning. Business associates? What kind of business did Robert Carter run that warranted 300 wedding guests? And how had they even fit everyone in our tiny church? Emma appeared at my other side, looking gorgeous in an emerald green dress that complemented her curls perfectly. The photographer wants to take some pictures with you before the ceremony starts, she said. Photographer. I blinked. We hired Mrs. Peterson from down the street to take photos with her digital camera. Oh, that's so sweet, Emma said. But Dad arranged for someone a bit more professional. She led me to a small room off the main sanctuary where a man in an expensive suit was adjusting professional lighting equipment that definitely hadn't been there when we'd done our rehearsal yesterday. Behind him stood a woman with multiple cameras hanging around her neck, the kind of equipment I'd only seen at celebrity weddings and in magazines. Miss Jones, I'm Marcus Wellington from Wellington Photography, the man said, extending his hand. We're honored to be documenting your special day. Wellington Photography, I'd heard that name before. They'd photographed the governor's daughter's wedding last year, the one that made the cover of Colorado Bride magazine. I think there's been some mistake, I started to say. But Susan placed a gentle hand on my arm. No mistake, dear. Robert and I just wanted to make sure this day was captured beautifully. Now, shall we take some portraits? The next 30 minutes passed in a blur of professional photography. Marcus positioned me in various spots around the church, adjusting lighting and giving me directions like I was a fashion model. His assistant documented it all. I kept catching glimpses of the sanctuary filling up even more. People continued to arrive, and I noticed several individuals who looked vaguely familiar, though I couldn't place where I'd seen them before. Sarah, I whispered when she returned from checking on the reception setup. Please tell me you know what's going on. Her face was pale. Elle, I want to check on the community center and it's not the community center anymore. What do you mean? I mean, there are catering trucks outside, expensive catering trucks and florists, and what looks like a full bar setup and party planners with clipboards directing people around like they're setting up for some kind of gala. My heart started racing. That's impossible. We booked the community center. We're serving barbecue from Jimmy's Place and grocery store cake. I think, Sarah said slowly, Mason's family might have made some changes. Before I could process this information, the church organist began playing the processional music. It wasn't the simple hymn we'd chosen, but something that sounded like it belonged in a cathedral, rich, complex, and played on what sounded like a much more expensive organ than the little electronic one the church normally used. "It's time," Susan said, appearing beside me with a bouquet that definitely wasn't the modest arrangement of daisies and baby's breath I'd ordered. This bouquet was a stunning cascade of white roses, peonies, and orchids that probably cost more than our entire original wedding budget. "Susan, I don't understand what's happening." She took my hands in hers, and for the first time, I noticed the massive diamond ring on her finger. Not the simple gold band she'd been wearing at dinner, but a rock the size of a grape that caught the light and threw it back in brilliant flashes. "Sweetheart," she said gently, "there are some things about our family that Mason wanted to tell you himself. But what's important right now is that you're about to marry the man you love, and he's waiting for you at that altar with the biggest smile I've ever seen." The music swelled, and I could hear the congregation rising to their feet. 300 strangers were waiting to watch me walk down the aisle to marry a carpenter from Montana, who apparently had secrets I'd never imagined. Sarah squeezed my hand. "Whatever's happening, Elle, Mason loves you. That part hasn't changed." I took a deep breath, clutched the mysterious orchid bouquet, and prepared to walk toward the biggest surprise of my life. The sanctuary doors opened, and I stepped into what felt like a completely different universe. The little white church I'd fallen in love with had been transformed into something out of a fairy tale. White silk draped every surface. Thousands of white roses and baby's breath created stunning arrangements at the end of each pew, and what appeared to be professional lighting cast everything in a warm golden glow. But it was the sea of faces that truly took my breath away. Every single person in that packed church turned to look at me, and I recognized exactly none of them. These weren't the casual friends and extended family I'd expected to see at Mason's wedding. These were people who belonged at galas and charity auctions. The women wore designer dresses and jewelry that caught the light like tiny stars, while the men looked like they'd stepped off the pages of Forbes magazine. And there, at the front of the church, stood Mason. Even from the back of the aisle, I could see his face light up when he saw me. He was wearing a tuxedo I'd never seen before, not the simple black suit we'd rented from the formal shop downtown, but something that looked custom-tailored and probably cost more than my car. His best man, who I'd expected to be his college roommate, Jake, was instead a man in his 40s wearing what looked like a Rolex. But Mason's smile was the same. That bright, genuine expression that had made me fall in love with him in the first place. Whatever was happening here, that smile reminded me that at the center of all this confusion was the man I was about to marry. I began walking down the aisle, my grandmother's vintage dress suddenly feeling wildly understated among all the elegance surrounding me. As I passed the pews, I caught snippets of whispered conversations that made my head spin. "She's lovely. Robert must be so pleased. I heard she's a teacher. How refreshing. The Carter family always knows how to throw an event." Carter family events? What did that even mean? Halfway down the aisle, I spotted a face that made me stop breathing for a moment. Governor Patricia Hendricks was sitting in the third row, smiling at me warmly. The actual governor of Colorado was at my wedding. Next door sat a man I recognized as the mayor of Denver, and behind them was a woman I was pretty sure I'd seen on the cover of Colorado Business Weekly. My legs felt wobbly as I continued walking, but Mason's eyes never left mine. When I finally reached the altar, he stepped forward and took my hand, his familiar touch grounding me in the midst of all the surreal luxury. "You look incredible," he whispered, and for a moment everything else faded away. The officiant began the ceremony, and I tried to focus on the words, on the vows we'd written together, on the promises we were making. But my mind kept wandering to the impossible guest list surrounding us. How did a carpenter from Montana know the governor of Colorado? When it came time for our vows, Mason's voice was steady and clear as he spoke the words we'd practiced together in our tiny apartment. But as he promised to love me through whatever surprises life might bring, there was something in his eyes that suggested he knew exactly what surprises were coming. My own vows felt surreal as I spoke them to this packed audience of strangers, but when I looked into Mason's face, the words came from my heart, just as they had when we'd practiced alone. "You may kiss the bride," the officiant announced, and Mason's lips met mine as 300 people erupted in applause. The photographers' cameras flashed continuously, and I realized this moment was being documented like a state event. As we walked back down the aisle together, now husband and wife, I caught sight of something that made my heart stop. In the very back pew, looking uncomfortable but definitely present, sat my parents. My father, Dr. Richard Jones, was wearing his best suit and looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. My mother, Dr. Patricia Jones, had her phone out and was taking pictures, tears streaming down her cheeks. They had come. Somehow, despite everything they'd said, they were here. "Mason," I whispered as we reached the back of the church. "My parents are here." He followed my gaze, and his expression shifted to something I couldn't quite read. "I know," he said quietly. "I'll explain everything at the reception." Before I could ask what he meant, we were swept outside by the photographer for more pictures. The parking lot had somehow been transformed as well. A red carpet led from the church steps to a line of luxury cars that definitely hadn't been there when I'd arrived. Rose petals covered the ground, and more professional photographers captured every moment. "Mrs. Carter," Marcus the photographer called out. "We'd like to get some shots by the Bentley." I looked around confused until I realized he was talking to me. Mrs. Carter, that was my name now. And apparently there was a Bentley involved in our wedding photos. The car was a pristine white Bentley Continental, decorated with white ribbons and more of those expensive roses. Mason helped me pose next to it, his hand warm on the small of my back, but I could feel the tension in his shoulders. "Whose car is this?" I whispered. "It's yours now," he said simply. "Wedding gift from my parents." A Bentley? His parents had given us a Bentley as a wedding gift? Carpenter's parents didn't give Bentleys as wedding gifts. After what felt like hundreds more photos, we were ushered into the back seat of the luxury car by a man in a chauffeur's uniform who addressed Mason as Mr. Carter, with a level of formality that suggested this wasn't their first meeting. As we drove the short distance to what should have been the community center, I stared out the window in shock. The parking lot was filled with more luxury vehicles, and professional valets were helping guests out of their cars. A red carpet led to an entrance that had been completely transformed with what looked like thousands of dollars worth of flowers and lighting. "Mason," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "What is happening?" He took my hands in his, and I could see the conflict in his face. "There's something I should have told you a long time ago. Something I wanted to tell you, but I wasn't sure how." "What kind of something?" He took a deep breath. "My family, we're not exactly who you think we are." The chauffeur opened our door, and the sounds of a full orchestra drifted out from what had once been a simple community center. Through the glass doors, I could see crystal chandeliers that definitely hadn't been there yesterday, and what appeared to be a full ballroom setup with round tables draped in white linens. "How? Not exactly," I managed to ask. Mason helped me out of the car, and as we stood on the red carpet with photographers capturing our every move, he looked into my eyes with an expression that was part love, part apology, and part something that might have been relief. "My father isn't just in business, Al. He owns Carter Industries where, well, Forbes estimated our family's net worth at around $3 billion last year." The world tilted sideways. $3 billion? My husband, my carpenter husband, who worried about overtime shifts and shopped for groceries with coupons, was a billionaire? "That's impossible," I whispered. "I know it sounds crazy. I wanted to tell you so many times, but I loved that you fell in love with me, not my bank account. I loved that you didn't care about money or status or any of that. You just loved me." Before I could respond, the doors to the reception venue opened, and a wave of classical music washed over us. Inside, I could see our 300 wedding guests mingling in what had been transformed into the most elegant event space I'd ever witnessed. And standing at the entrance, beaming with pride, were Robert and Susan Carter, apparently two of the wealthiest people in America, waiting to welcome their new daughter-in-law to a world I never knew existed. Walking into that reception felt like stepping through a portal into another dimension. The community center I'd visited just days ago had been completely gutted and rebuilt into something that belonged in a luxury hotel. Crystal chandeliers hung from a ceiling that had somehow been raised and draped in flowing white silk. The concrete floors were now covered in gleaming hardwood, and floor-to-ceiling windows had been installed where blank walls used to be, offering stunning views of the Rocky Mountains. Round tables for 10 were positioned throughout the space, each one covered in ivory linens and topped with towering centerpieces of white orchids, roses, and peonies. The silverware looked like actual silver, and the wine glasses were crystal that caught the light like diamonds. A full orchestra was set up on a stage that definitely hadn't existed yesterday, playing classical music that made our original playlist of country songs seem laughably inadequate. But what truly made my knees weak was the sheer scale of it all. This wasn't a reception for 50 people eating barbecue off paper plates. This was a black tie gala for 300 guests who were now applauding as Mason and I entered. Professional servers in crisp uniforms circulated with champagne that probably cost more per bottle than I made in a week. Mrs. Carter, a woman in an elegant black dress, approached us with a clipboard. "I'm Jennifer Walsh, your event coordinator. Everything is proceeding perfectly on schedule. The cocktail hour will continue for another 30 minutes, then we'll transition to dinner. The menu has been tailored to your preferences, as discussed." I stared at her blankly. I never discussed any menu with anyone. Jennifer's smile didn't falter. "Of course, the preferences your mother-in-law shared with us. She mentioned you love Mediterranean cuisine and have a weakness for chocolate desserts." Mason's hand tightened on mine. "Thank you, Jennifer. Everything looks incredible." As Jennifer walked away, I turned to Mason with what I'm sure was a wild look in my eyes. "How long has this been planned?" "The orchestra, the flowers, the everything." I can explain." A booming voice interrupted us, and I turned to see a tall man in an expensive suit approaching with his arms outstretched. "Congratulations. What a beautiful ceremony." Mason straightened slightly. "Senator Williams, thank you for coming." This is Senator David Williams." "Senator, my wife, Liliana." "Senator Williams, as in, United States Senator Williams." I shook his hand on autopilot while my brain tried to process that a U.S. senator was at my wedding reception. "Your husband's family has been invaluable to Colorado's economic development," the senator said to me warmly. "And I hear you're a teacher. How wonderful. Education is the foundation of everything." Before I could respond, another couple approached, then another, and suddenly I was in the middle of a receiving line of people whose names I recognized from newspapers and television: the CEO of a major tech company, a federal judge, the owner of the Colorado Rockies. All of them spoke to Mason with the familiarity of old friends and treated me with the kind of respect usually reserved for billionaires' wives. "I need some air," I whispered to Mason after the 10th introduction to someone whose net worth probably exceeded most countries' GDP. He immediately guided me toward a set of French doors that opened onto what had once been the community center's tiny back patio, but was now an elegant outdoor terrace, complete with heat lamps, more flowers, and a view of the mountains that had been somehow enhanced with professional lighting. "How is this possible?" I asked once we were alone. "Yesterday, this was a community center with folding chairs and fluorescent lighting." Mason ran his hand through his hair, messing up the perfect styling for the first time all day. "My mother has a team of people who specialize in event transformation. When she sets her mind to something, it happens fast." "A team of people?" I repeated slowly. "Mason, normal mothers don't have teams of people." "I know." He sat down on a bench that was definitely more expensive than our entire apartment's furniture combined. "Ella, I've been trying to figure out how to tell you this for months." I sat beside him, my grandmother's dress pooling around us. "Tell me what, exactly? That you're rich? That your family is rich? That you've been lying to me about who you are?" "Not lying," he said quickly. "Never lying. Everything I told you about myself is true. I did grow up in Montana. I do love working with my hands. I really was living paycheck to paycheck when we met." "Then how?" "Because I chose to." He turned to face me fully. "When I turned 18, my father offered me a position at Carter Industries. Vice President Track, corner office, 7-figure salary. I turned it down." I blinked at him. "You turned down a 7-figure salary?" "I wanted to make my own way. I wanted to know who I was outside of the family money. So I moved to Denver, got a job in construction, and tried to live like a normal person." Tried to live like a normal person. I echoed. "Mason, we split grocery bills. I watched you stress about overtime pay. You let me believe we were struggling financially." "We were," he said earnestly. "I was. I've been living entirely off my construction salary for the past 3 years. I haven't touched a penny of family money. But they've been watching," I said, pieces clicking together. "Your parents knew exactly who I was, where I worked, what I liked to eat." Mason nodded reluctantly. "They had you investigated before I brought you to meet them. It's standard protocol for anyone who gets close to family members." "I'm sorry, Elle. I hated that part of it." "Investigated." The word felt bitter in my mouth. "What did they find out about me that I don't know about myself?" "Nothing bad," he said quickly. "Just basic background stuff, financial records, employment history, education. They were actually impressed that you've never had so much as a parking ticket." I stood up abruptly, needing to pace. "This is insane, Mason. People don't get investigated for dating construction workers. People don't transform community centers overnight. People don't invite U.S. senators to their weddings." "The Carters do," he said quietly. Through the French doors, I could see our wedding guests mingling, laughing, drinking champagne that probably cost more than most people's rent. My parents were standing near the orchestra, looking simultaneously awed and terrified. My mother was actually taking notes in a small notebook, probably documenting every detail for her country club friends. "Your parents came," Mason said, following my gaze. "How did they even know to come?" "They said they weren't coming. They were very clear about not supporting this marriage." Mason's silence was answer enough. "You called them," I said. "Or your family did." "My father called your father yesterday morning. They had a conversation about the importance of family being present for life's most significant moments." "What kind of conversation?" "The kind that happens when Robert Carter, founder and CEO of Carter Industries, personally calls to invite you to his son's wedding." I leaned against the railing, staring out at the mountain view. "So, they didn't have a change of heart about you being good enough for me. They found out you were rich." "Well, that's exactly what happened, isn't it?" My parents, who refused to attend their daughter's wedding because her fiancé was just a carpenter, suddenly showed up the moment they discovered he was actually a billionaire. Mason moved to stand beside me. "Does it matter why they came?" "They're here now." "It matters because it proves everything I already knew about them," I said, my voice breaking slightly. "They don't love me. They love the idea of what I can do for their social status." Inside, Jennifer, the event coordinator, was announcing that dinner would be served in 10 minutes. Through the glass, I could see our guests moving toward their assigned tables, each marked with calligraphy place cards that probably cost more than our original wedding invitations. "What happens now?" I asked. "Do I go back in there and pretend I belong in a room full of senators and CEOs? Do I smile and make small talk with people whose weekly grocery budget is more than I make in a year?" Mason took my hands in his. "You don't have to pretend anything. You belong in that room because you're my wife, because you're brilliant and kind, and you make me want to be a better person every single day." "But I'm not one of them, Mason. I grade papers at the kitchen table and shop at thrift stores and drive a car with duct tape holding the bumper on." "Neither am I," he said firmly. "Money doesn't change who you are inside, Elle. I'm still the same guy who fell in love with you in that coffee shop. I still want to build things with my hands and come home to you every night." The orchestra began playing what sounded like a dinner chime, and I could see guests taking their seats at tables that probably cost more to set than most people's wedding budgets. I looked at my husband, my billionaire husband, and realized that everything I thought I knew about my life had just changed forever. Taking a deep breath, I walked back into the reception with Mason's hand in mine. If I was going to be Mrs. Carter now, I might as well see what that actually meant. The dinner was already underway, and we were escorted to a head table that faced the entire room. I found myself seated between Mason and his father, Robert, with a perfect view of all 300 guests. The meal was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Each course was a work of art, presented by servers who moved with choreographed precision. The appetizer alone, some kind of seared scallop with truffle oil and microgreens, probably cost more than most people's entire dinner out. Wine flowed freely, and I noticed that every bottle being served had labels I couldn't pronounce and vintage dates that suggested they'd been aging longer than I'd been alive. "So, Aleliana," Robert Carter said beside me, his voice carrying the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to being listened to. "Mason tells me you teach 4th grade." Yes, I managed, still feeling surreal about having a casual conversation with a billionaire. "At Riverside Elementary. I've been there for 3 years. Education is the great equalizer," he said thoughtfully. "Some of my most successful business partnerships have been with people who started with nothing but a good teacher who believed in them." Despite everything, I found myself warming to Mason's father. Unlike my own parents, who viewed teaching as something I did until I found a real career, Robert spoke about education with genuine respect. "Mason also mentioned you're working on your master's degree," Susan added from across the table. "Educational leadership, isn't it?" I nodded, surprised they knew so much about my academic plans. "I'm hoping to become a principal someday. I want to make schools better for kids who don't have advantages at home." "That's exactly the kind of thinking we need more of," Robert said. "In fact, Carter Industries has an education foundation that might interest you. We fund innovative programs in underserved schools." Before I could respond, the orchestra shifted to a softer melody, and Jennifer appeared beside our table. "Mr. and Mrs. Carter, it's time for your first dance." My stomach dropped. In all the chaos of discovering Mason's true identity, I'd completely forgotten about the traditional wedding reception events. Our first dance was supposed to be to "You Are My Sunshine," played from someone's iPhone playlist. Instead, I was being guided onto a proper dance floor while a full orchestra prepared to provide the soundtrack to what felt like the most watched moment of my life, an instrumental version of the song we'd chosen. Somehow, they'd known. As we swayed together under the crystal chandeliers, with 300 pairs of eyes watching our every move, I finally felt a moment of peace. "I'm still me," Mason whispered in my ear as we danced. "And you're still you. That's all that matters." "Is it though?" I whispered back. "Because I'm pretty sure me doesn't know how to be married to a billionaire." "Good thing I don't know how to be a billionaire husband either," he said with a smile. "We'll figure it out together." When the song ended, applause filled the room, and I realized that dozens of phones had been capturing our dance. Tomorrow, photos of our wedding would probably be all over social media and society pages I'd never heard of. As other couples joined us on the dance floor, I spotted my parents approaching from across the room. My mother was practically glowing with excitement, while my father looked like he was still processing everything he'd witnessed. "Aleliana, sweetheart," my mother gushed as they reached us. "This is absolutely incredible. The flowers alone must have cost more than most people's entire weddings." There it was. Not, "I'm sorry we almost missed your special day," or "we're proud of you." Just an immediate focus on the money. "Mom, Dad," I said carefully, "I'm glad you decided to come." My father cleared his throat awkwardly. When Mr. Carter called yesterday, he made it clear that family should be present for such an important occasion. He's quite persuasive. Persuasive how? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. "Well," my mother jumped in, her voice dropping to an excited whisper. "He mentioned that Carter Industries is looking to expand their healthcare investments, and your father's expertise in medical technology could be quite valuable." My heart sank. Even now, at my own wedding, my parents were networking. My father added, straightening his tie. He suggested that perhaps we'd been too hasty in our judgment of Mason's prospects. I looked at Mason, who was standing beside me with a carefully neutral expression. "Did you know about this?" I asked my father to call them, he admitted. But I didn't know about any business discussions. Before I could respond, the orchestra announced that it was time for the father-daughter dance. My father stepped forward expectantly, but I hesitated. This was the man who'd refused to walk me down the aisle just hours ago, now ready to dance with me because he discovered I'd married into money. "I don't think so," I said quietly. My father's face fell. "Aleliana, I know we made some mistakes, but some mistakes." I couldn't keep the anger out of my voice anymore. "You told me you couldn't support my marriage. You said Mason was beneath our family. You made it clear that you'd rather miss my wedding than pretend to approve of my choices." "We were protecting you," my mother said defensively. "We thought he was just some construction worker with no prospects." "He was just some construction worker," I said. "And I loved him anyway. But you couldn't see past his bank account to the person he actually is." The entire reception seemed to quiet around us, though the orchestra continued playing softly. I was vaguely aware that many of our guests were watching the drama unfold, but I was beyond caring. "The only reason you're here right now is because you found out he's rich," I continued. "If he really was just a carpenter, you'd be at home right now, telling your friends about your daughter's unfortunate life choices." "That's not fair," my father said. But his voice lacked conviction. "Isn't it?" I looked around the opulent reception at the hundreds of guests who belonged to a world I'd never known existed. "Tell me honestly, Dad, if this was the same community center reception we originally planned, if Mason really was just making construction wages, would you be here?" The silence that followed was answer enough. Robert Carter appeared beside us, his presence immediately commanding attention. "Dr. Jones, Mrs. Jones," he said politely. "Perhaps we could continue this conversation at a more appropriate time. This is, after all, a celebration." My parents nodded quickly, clearly intimidated by Mason's father's quiet authority. They melted back into the crowd, leaving me standing in the middle of the dance floor, feeling like I just had my heart broken all over again. "I'm sorry," Mason said softly. "I thought if they saw how much I love you, they didn't come for love," I said, watching my parents across the room as they introduced themselves to other wealthy guests. "They came for networking opportunities." Emma Carter appeared at my elbow, elegant and warm. "Want to get some fresh air? There's something I think you should see." She led me back outside to the terrace, where the mountain view was now illuminated by professional lighting that made the peaks look magical against the night sky. On a small table sat a laptop computer, its screen glowing softly. "What's this?" I asked. "Social media," Emma said with a grin. "Your wedding is trending." I stared at the screen in shock. Hashtag Mason and Liliana Carter wedding was indeed trending on multiple platforms, with hundreds of posts from guests sharing photos and videos of the ceremony and reception. But what surprised me wasn't the social media attention. It was the comments. Most beautiful bride ever. Goals. This is what true love looks like. She seems so down to earth and sweet. Lucky girl, but he's lucky too. Look how happy they are together. Real love story. You can see it in their eyes. Emma, I said slowly. These people don't even know me. No, she said with a smile. But they can see what we all see. That you and Mason are perfect for each other. Money or no money. As I scrolled through hundreds of positive comments from strangers who had watched our story unfold online, I realized something important. My parents' approval had never really mattered. What mattered was the life Mason and I were going to build together, and the family that had welcomed me with open arms from the very beginning. The orchestra began playing again, and, through the French doors, I could see Mason searching the crowd for me, his face lighting up when he spotted me on the terrace. For the first time since walking into that transformed church, I felt ready to embrace whatever came next. Walking back into the reception, I felt different, lighter somehow, as if confronting my parents had lifted a weight I didn't realize I'd been carrying. Mason immediately appeared at my side, his relief visible when he saw my face. "How are you feeling?" he asked softly. "Like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be," I said, and meant it. The evening continued to unfold like something out of a dream. The cake-cutting ceremony involved a 4-tier masterpiece that looked like it belonged in a museum rather than being eaten. Each layer was a different flavor: vanilla bean with raspberry filling, chocolate with salted caramel, lemon with lavender buttercream, and red velvet with cream cheese frosting. It was so far removed from our original grocery store sheet cake that I couldn't help but laugh. "What's funny?" Mason asked as we posed for photos with the ornate cake. "I'm just thinking about how we spent 3 weeks debating whether we could afford the upgrade from vanilla to chocolate," I said. "And now we have 4 different flavors, each probably costing more than our entire original budget." "Do you miss it?" he asked quietly. "The simple version we planned?" I considered this as the photographer directed us to cut the first slice. "I miss the innocence of it," I admitted. "But I don't miss feeling like we had to choose between things we wanted because of money." As the evening progressed, I found myself in conversations that would have terrified me just hours earlier. Senator Williams' wife, Margaret, turned out to be a former teacher who was passionate about education reform. We spent 20 minutes discussing literacy programs and standardized testing while our husbands talked about infrastructure bills. "You know," Margaret said, sipping her champagne, "the Carter Education Foundation is always looking for passionate educators to help guide their programs. You should consider getting involved." Before I could respond, a commotion near the entrance caught my attention. A young woman in an evening gown was arguing with what appeared to be security personnel. Her voice carried across the reception. "I'm family," she was saying loudly. "Ask Mason. He'll tell you I'm supposed to be here." Mason's expression darkened immediately. "Excuse me," he said to the group we'd been talking with, and headed toward the disturbance. I followed, curious and concerned. The woman was probably in her mid-20s, with platinum blonde hair and the kind of confidence that comes from never being told no. She was beautiful in an expensive, high-maintenance way that made me suddenly conscious of my grandmother's vintage dress. "Clarissa," Mason said as we approached, his voice carefully controlled. "What are you doing here?" "Congratulating you, of course," she said with a bright smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Though, I have to say, I'm surprised you didn't invite me personally." I looked between them, sensing an undercurrent I didn't understand. "Mason, who is this?" "Clarissa Worthington," the woman said, extending a perfectly manicured hand. "And you must be the lucky bride." "I'm an old friend of Mason's." "A very old friend." The way she emphasized very made my stomach tighten. But before I could respond, Robert Carter appeared beside us with a kind of expression that suggested this conversation was about to end quickly. "Miss Worthington," he said coolly, "I don't believe you were on our guest list." "Oh, come now, Mr. Carter," Clarissa said with a laugh that sounded like breaking glass. "Surely there's room for one more guest at such a lavish affair." "Security will escort you out," Robert said simply, then turned to Mason and me. "I apologize for the ex-girlfriend," he said briefly. "From before I moved to Denver. It's been over for years." Something in his tone suggested there was more to the story, but before I could ask, the orchestra began playing the last dance of the evening. Mason took my hand and led me onto the dance floor one final time as our guests gathered around us. Any regrets? He asked as the chandeliers cast everything in a warm glow. The mountain views through the windows were breathtaking, and we were surrounded by people who had traveled from across the country to celebrate with us. My parents stood at the edge of the crowd, looking somewhat lost, but trying to fit in. Emma was dancing with someone who might have been a tech billionaire, laughing at something he'd said. Robert and Susan Carter watched their son with obvious pride and affection. Just one, I said finally. Mason's face fell. What? I regret not knowing about your family sooner, I said. Not because of the money, but because I missed out on months of knowing how wonderful they are. His relief was palpable. They've been dying to properly welcome you to the family. Mom's already planning Christmas, and she wants to know if you'd be interested in joining the Foundation's board of directors, the Education Foundation, among others. Carter Industries supports about 15 different charitable organizations. Mom thinks you'd be perfect for the education and children's welfare boards. The idea of having the resources to actually make a difference in children's lives was both thrilling and overwhelming. Mason, I don't know anything about running a foundation. You know about teaching kids and making their lives better, he said. That's more important than knowing how to read financial reports. As the song ended, Robert Carter stepped onto the stage and took the microphone from the orchestra conductor. Ladies and gentlemen, his voice carried easily across the room. Thank you all for being here tonight to celebrate Mason and Aleliana's wedding. As many of you know, family is everything to Susan and me. Tonight, we're not just celebrating a marriage. We're welcoming a remarkable young woman into our family. He looked directly at me, and I felt tears starting to form. Aleliana, you've made our son happier than we've ever seen him. Your dedication to education, your kindness, and your genuine heart represent everything we value most. We're honored to call you our daughter. The applause was thunderous, and I realized that this feeling of being truly accepted and valued for who I was what I'd been missing from my relationship with my own parents my entire life. Later, as the evening wound down and guests began to leave, I found myself saying goodbye to people whose names I would never have imagined knowing. The governor hugged me and invited Mason and me to dinner at the state capitol. The tech CEO handed me his card and said his company was always looking for innovative education consultants. 3 different foundation directors asked if I'd be interested in joining their boards. My parents approached as we were preparing to leave for our honeymoon suite at the Four Seasons downtown. Aleliana, my mother said hesitantly. We want you to know that we're proud of you. Are you? I asked. Or are you proud of who I married? My father stepped forward. We made mistakes today, big ones. We let our prejudices cloud our judgment about Mason. And more importantly, we failed to support you when you needed us most. You did, I agreed. Can you forgive us? My mother asked, tears in her eyes. I looked at these people who had raised me but never really seen me, who had come to my wedding for all the wrong reasons, but were at least trying to admit their mistakes. I can forgive you, I said, finally. But things are going to be different between us from now on. Different how? My father asked. You're going to have to earn back my trust, I said. And you're going to have to accept that my life is my own, regardless of how much money my husband has. They nodded, looking chastened. And I realized that this was probably the first real conversation we'd ever had as adults. Mason and I finally left the reception at nearly midnight, climbing into the white Bentley that was apparently now ours. As we drove through the quiet Denver streets toward the hotel, I reflected on the most surreal day of my life. So, I said, leaning against Mason's shoulder, what happens now? Do I have to learn how to be rich? You have to learn how to be happy, he said, kissing the top of my head. Everything else is just details. Looking out at the city lights, I realized that for the first time in my life, I felt like I truly belonged somewhere. Not because of money or status, but because I'd found a family that valued me for exactly who I was. Tomorrow, I'd wake up as Mrs. Aleliana Carter, wife of a billionaire, potential board member of multiple foundations, and stepdaughter to 2 of the most powerful people in Colorado. But tonight, I was just a woman who had married the love of her life, surrounded by people who genuinely cared about her happiness. And that felt like the greatest fortune of all. 6 months later, I stood in the boardroom of Carter Industries, looking out at the Denver skyline through floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a view I never could have imagined having access to. The quarterly Education Foundation meeting had just concluded, and I was reviewing the proposals we'd approved for funding: 12 new literacy programs across Colorado, 3 STEM initiatives for underserved schools, and a teacher training program that would impact over 500 educators. Mrs. Carter, Jennifer Walsh, the same woman who had coordinated our wedding, now served as the foundation's program director. The scholarship recipients are here for the award ceremony. I smoothed my navy blue dress, designer now, though I still felt strange about the price tags, and headed toward the conference room where 20 high school seniors waited with their families. These students would receive full college scholarships funded by the Carter Education Foundation, and seeing their faces when we announced their awards never got old. "Good afternoon, everyone," I said as I entered the room. "Congratulations to all of our scholarship recipients. Your hard work and dedication have brought you here today." As I handed out the scholarship certificates, I reflected on how much my life had changed since that surreal wedding day. The transition hadn't been seamless. Learning to navigate charity galas, board meetings, and the social expectations that came with being a Carter had required more adjustment than I'd anticipated. But the work itself, being able to make a real difference in children's education with resources I'd never dreamed of having, made every awkward moment worthwhile. One of the scholarship recipients, a young girl named Maria Gonzalez from East Denver, reminded me so much of my former students that I lingered to talk with her after the ceremony. "Mrs. Carter," she said shyly, "I wanted to thank you personally. This scholarship means I can become a teacher like I've always dreamed." "What grade do you want to teach?" I asked. "Elementary. I want to work with kids who don't have much support at home, like I did. I want to be the teacher who believes in them." I felt tears pricking my eyes. "That's exactly why we do this, Maria. Teachers like you can change the world, one student at a time." After the ceremony, I drove home to the house that still sometimes felt like I was living in someone else's life. Mason and I had moved out of our tiny Denver apartment into a sprawling estate in Cherry Hills Village, complete with mountain views, a home office for my foundation work, and a workshop where Mason could pursue his carpentry projects. He'd officially joined Carter Industries 6 months ago, but insisted on maintaining his hands-on approach to construction projects. I found him in the kitchen, still wearing his work clothes and covered in sawdust, preparing dinner with the kind of focus he brought to everything he did. "How was the scholarship ceremony?" he asked, wrapping me in a hug despite being dusty. "Perfect. We have 20 kids who are going to college who might not have had the chance otherwise." I pulled back to look at him. "How was your day? Still enjoying the corporate world?" Mason laughed. "I spent the morning in board meetings discussing sustainable building materials and the afternoon actually installing solar panels on a low-income housing project. It's the best of both worlds." As we cooked together, my phone buzzed with a text message. The contact name made me pause. "Mom, the strangest thing happened today," the message read. "I met a woman at the country club whose daughter received one of your foundation scholarships. She couldn't stop talking about how much the program meant to their family. I wanted you to know that your father and I are proud of the work you're doing." I showed the message to Mason, who read it with raised eyebrows. "That's progress," he said carefully. "It is," I agreed. "Slow progress, but progress." My relationship with my parents had indeed been slowly rebuilding over the past 6 months. They'd made genuine efforts to get to know Mason for who he was, rather than what he represented financially. My father had even started volunteering at a clinic he'd learned about through Carter Industries' healthcare initiatives. "Speaking of your parents," Mason said, "they're coming to dinner on Sunday, remember? Along with my parents, Emma, and probably half the Colorado political establishment." I said with a laugh, Sunday dinners at the Carter house have become quite the affair. It was true. What had started as simple family dinners had evolved into weekly gatherings that somehow always included interesting guests. Last week, we had dinner with the mayor of Denver and a Nobel Prize-winning physicist who was consulting on one of Robert's renewable energy projects. The week before, it was a group of teachers from one of our foundation schools and a former Secretary of Education. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. The caller ID showed Emma's name. "Eleliana." Emma's voice was excited. "Have you seen the news?" "What news?" "Check Channel 7. They're doing a feature on the Carter Education Foundation's impact, and you're the main interview." I grabbed the remote and turned on the television, finding the local news station. Sure enough, there was footage from today's scholarship ceremony, followed by an interview I'd given last week about the foundation's programs. The Carter Education Foundation has funded over 50 programs in its first year under new leadership, the reporter was saying. Director Eleliana Carter, a former elementary school teacher, has brought a grassroots approach to the foundation that's already showing remarkable results. The interview segment showed me talking about the importance of supporting both students and teachers, with statistics about improved literacy rates and college enrollment in the schools we'd supported. Mrs. Carter represents a new generation of philanthropic leadership, the reporter continued. Her background in education has helped the foundation focus on programs that create lasting change rather than just providing funding. Mason wrapped his arms around me from behind as we watched. Look at you changing the world. We're changing the world, I corrected. None of this would be possible without Carter Industries' support. The news segment ended with footage of our wedding day. Apparently, that event was still considered newsworthy 6 months later. Seeing ourselves dancing at that incredible reception, surrounded by all those influential guests, felt like watching someone else's life. Do you ever miss it? Mason asked quietly. The simplicity of before? I turned in his arms to face him. I miss some things. I miss the feeling that our problems could be solved with overtime pay and coupon clipping. I miss feeling like I knew exactly who I was and where I fit in the world. But I don't miss feeling powerless to help the kids who needed more than I could give them on a teacher's salary. I don't miss watching talented students give up on college because they couldn't afford it. I don't miss feeling like the problems I cared about were too big for me to make a real difference. We were interrupted by the doorbell, which in our new house played an elaborate chime that still made me jump. Mason went to answer it, returning with a massive flower arrangement and an envelope. Delivery for Mrs. Carter, he said with a grin. The flowers were from the family of one of our scholarship recipients, with a note thanking me for making dreams possible. The envelope contained an invitation to speak at the National Education Foundation's annual conference in Washington, D.C. They want you to give the keynote address on innovative philanthropy and education, Mason said, reading over my shoulder. That's terrifying, I said immediately. That's amazing, he countered. Elle, you've become one of the most respected voices in education philanthropy in less than a year. As if to prove his point, my phone rang again. This time it was a producer from a national morning show wanting to interview me about the scholarship program for a segment on education funding. After I hung up, Mason and I looked at each other and started laughing. Remember when your biggest worry was whether we could afford flowers for the wedding, he said. Remember when you were afraid to tell me your family had money because you thought I might love you for the wrong reasons? I countered. We finished preparing dinner in comfortable silence, and as we sat down to eat, I realized that this quiet moment with my husband in our kitchen, talking about work that mattered and planning for a future that could impact thousands of lives, was exactly the life I was meant to have. My phone buzzed one more time with a text from Robert Gonzalez. Thank you for seeing her potential when others didn't. You've changed our entire family's future. I showed the message to Mason, who smiled that same bright smile that had made me fall in love with him in a coffee shop that felt like a lifetime ago. So, he said, reaching across the table to take my hand. Any regrets about marrying a billionaire? Just one, I said, enjoying the moment of worry that crossed his face. What's that? I regret that it took a wedding disaster to show me that sometimes the most beautiful life comes from the most unexpected places. Outside our windows, the Colorado mountains stood silhouetted against the sunset. And I thought about the girl who had walked down the aisle 6 months ago, afraid her family wouldn't show up to her wedding. That girl had no idea she was walking toward a life beyond her wildest dreams, not because of money, but because she was about to discover what it meant to be truly valued, truly supported, and truly loved. The wedding my parents had tried to ignore had indeed become the event of the century. But more importantly, it had become the beginning of a story I never could have written for myself, one where a teacher from Denver got to change the world, one student at a time. And that, truly, was worth more than all the Bentleys, designer dresses, and crystal chandeliers in the world. So, tell me, after hearing all this, what would you have done in my shoes? Would you have confronted your parents at the reception like I did, or would you have waited? Have you ever had a secret like Mason's completely flip your world upside down? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below.